Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for joining me. Well, David Taylor, a business leader in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, joins me. We're going to chat a little bit about the state budget and a situation with a fiscal crisis that David wants to talk about. But first, gun control, it's back. Given the horrific shooting in Nashville, we'll get to those subjects and more after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
All right, lots of topics to chat about this morning. Joining me is Marc Levy. He's a reporter with the Associated Press, and Angela Couloumbis. She's also a reporter with Spotlight PA. All right, Angela, I'm going to start with you. I'll tell you, what a horrific shooting that's dominated, rightfully so, the national and state news. And that brings up the issue of gun control that comes up in our state over the course of many decades repeatedly. So what's the situation now? And obviously, we're going to talk first about the state legislature.
Absolutely. Well, for the first time in more than a decade, Democrats have taken control of the House, giving them control of the agenda, and they have vowed that they're going to try and pass certain gun control measures. There's a lot that's been discussed over the years that's never gone anywhere. There's been discussion about a red flag law, which would allow a judge to temporarily take a person's guns away if they are deemed a risk to themselves or to others. There has been lots of discussion about expanding background checks, discussion about certification and training for first-time gun owners. But even though the House is controlled by Democrats, the other chamber is controlled by Republicans, and we don't know yet if there's going to be buy-in there.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, part of the problem, not problem, but if you want to make a change to the gun control laws, as Angela points out, you got both houses of the legislature and then the governor. So there are, in a sense, three institutions involved in all of this. But the fact of the matter is Pennsylvania historically has been, you know, a gun state. Lots of hunters, lots of people in small town and rural parts of our state in particular who own guns.
Right. You have a legislature that's been historically protective of gun rights. That's changing. The profile of Democrats in the legislature is changing. They're more in favor of gun control and restrictions. You also have Philadelphia, the state's biggest city, that is having record murder rates of gun violence the past couple of years. That's driving this. We're also seeing a lot of mass shootings around the country. In 2018, you know, Pennsylvania went through the worst episode of anti-Semitic violence in which 11 people were killed in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. So there's a lot driving the agenda right now, and you have a more solidified Democratic caucus behind gun control or gun restriction legislation, bills designed to prevent the street-level violence we see day to day in Philadelphia, bills designed to prevent mass shootings, bills designed to prevent accidents and suicides.
One other aspect I think that is part of the discussion is, should municipalities, you know, the officials in municipalities be able to institute some gun control measures? Is that correct?
Yes, and Philadelphia has actually been at the forefront of that, and they have a lawsuit that is now pending before the state's highest court that will have the court decide on that question. Can municipalities make their own gun laws, or do they have to be uniform statewide? Right. And there have been other cities and entities, gun control entities, that have filed briefs, friends of the court, in that lawsuit, and it is being very closely watched.
Yeah. I mean, given the complexity of municipal governments, that might be difficult to, not maybe to enforce, but for people to understand as they go from one jurisdiction to another about what the actual gun, you know, as they travel through the state.
That's right. I mean, one of the questions at play here in the court case is that the Constitution grants municipalities the right to protect the health of their residents. And so one of the things the court will have to do here is decide what interest does the legislature have in preventing municipalities from going farther than state law when it comes to restricting the use of firearms?
Right.
And what is a municipality's responsibility when it comes to protecting the health of its residents, and does gun violence play a part in that? Is that protected under that?
Yeah.
So we've seen state Supreme Courts before throw out this type of a challenge. This is a different type of challenge. We'll see where it goes, given that there's a Democratic majority on the state Supreme Court, and as I mentioned earlier, there's record murder rates in Philadelphia.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about, we've had mail-in ballots, and there have been, big disputes over that, and there's something called, I know you're not going to believe this, called ballot curing, C-U-R-I-N-G. We'll get to that subject after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, Angela Couloumbis, I don't even know how to explain ballot curing, C-U-R-I-N-G. Well, for the folks, explain what's ballot curing.
Yeah, really, that is a technical sort of wonky term for fixing your ballot, and it mostly applies to mail ballots.
Yeah.
We've seen that since 2020. There's a requirement in the law that you have to have a secrecy envelope, yep. And then you also have to sign and date the outside of your mail ballot.
Right.
And we have seen people make mistakes, write the wrong date, forget to sign. And some counties, starting in 2020, decided that they were going to contact those voters ahead of the election or by election day to come in and cure or fix whatever the error is.
Put a date on or sign it if they're missing, right?
Right. And there has been pushback by Republicans who feel that that goes beyond what the law, mail ballot law authorized, the law known as Act 77. And there have been multiple court cases to try and get some sort of decision on what is allowed and what isn't. And this past week, we saw that there was a Commonwealth Court decision, but unfortunately, it did not clear up the confusion on whether counties can do it. The judge basically dismissed the case, and what the outcome is that certain counties can still continue doing that with their voters. But unfortunately, that is not uniform across the state.
Any sense that the state legislature is going to modify? I mean, anything dealing with mail-in ballots in the state legislature right now is very controversial.
It's very controversial. Donald Trump in 2020 sort of poisoned the well when it came to mail-in voting. He basically claimed it was rife with fraud. There's just no evidence of that.
Correct.
But after the 2022 election in November, in which Democrats won the election for governor and U.S. Senate and nationwide kept control of the U.S. Senate, from top-down Republicans, the RNC chair, the state party chair here, were saying Republicans need to embrace mail-in voting. We're getting beaten badly by it. It's a way to get more of our voters to vote. We need to embrace it. And so, in theory, maybe that means Republicans will stop sort of their legal challenges to mail-in voting in Pennsylvania, and instead, in the legislature, maybe they will work then to sort of fix the gaps and the glitches in the mail-in voting law.
I want to stay with you, Mark. All right. Governor Shapiro says for teachers, nurses, and police, they ought to have a tax credit, $2,500 a year. It would go on for 3 years. But there's now some sense that might not work out as Governor Shapiro would like to see it work out.
Right. So the rub here is that most people getting hired as a teacher, nurse, or police officer are not going to make enough money and pay enough in state taxes to actually get that $2,500. So it's a tax credit. You get the check mailed to you back with your tax return. But most people are going to be getting hired in the $50,000 to $55,000 range. Maybe some police officers in southeastern Pennsylvania will be making in the 60s and 70s. But by and large, you would get a lot less than that $2,500. Some people who work a part year, their first year, might see a tax credit of $500, $700 instead of that $2,500.
Income related is basically what you're saying.
Right. This is on the state income tax. It's not a rebate. It's a tax credit. You only get back what you pay in state taxes up to $2,500. We're seeing a lot of states where governors are saying we have to raise teacher pay. And what they're doing is they're setting a minimum. They're raising it up to $60,000 or $65,000, or they're raising it by a percentage across the board. Josh Shapiro, the governor here, his idea is to do this tax credit.
Well, look, I want to thank you both for coming in, providing this very important update. All right, coming up, we have David Taylor. He's the president of Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. We're going to talk about the state budget, and also David wants to chat about the possibility of a fiscal crisis down the road for the state of Pennsylvania.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by
Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, as I mentioned earlier, business leader David Taylor joins me. He's the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. All right, David, the legislature is now taking up Governor Josh Shapiro's first budget message, $44.4 billion. There's aspects of that the business community likes, the labor community likes, and conversely, some things that the business community is not, I'll put it this way, wild about, doesn't like, and the same for labor. So go ahead.
Well, first of all, yes, the Governor Shapiro has put forward his first budget proposal, and that the House and Senate Appropriations Committees are, undergoing hearings to examine that department by department. I wanted to talk about the larger issue. I mean, you mentioned the total spend number, and Pennsylvania's financial situation at the moment looks good because we still have monies from Washington, COVID relief, American Rescue Plan, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, so the coffers are full. The problem is that there are underlying trends that we have to address, because over time we're going to wind up in a bad place if we don't take those steps now. So your point is, well, what would you recommend then if you think this budget, $44 billion? Well, the spend is too high, and obviously we need to get more value out of dollars being spent. Like, how money is spent is at least as important as how much is spent. But the problem in Pennsylvania is that we have a structural deficit, which means that every year mandatory spending on things like Medicaid and programs for seniors, benefits that have been promised and that by law have to be paid for, that the amount that we have to pay there grows faster than the natural growth of the economy and the tax revenues that come from that. So that means that the gap gets a little wider every year, which is why our budget is always out of balance.
Yeah. Well, one of the things in the program is a major decrease in
corporate net income tax.
And
that, and that's welcoming. One of the things that was most heartening about the governor's budget address was, his emphasis on competitiveness. And again, talking about the corporate net income tax, C&I, that the tax rates and tax collections are two different things. The tax rate has been much too high, continues to be too high, and as a result, it suffocates growth, which means that the economy doesn't expand the way it should, which means that we don't get the revenues that we would. If we can have broad-based growth, that will lead to the revenues that will properly fund state government. So attacking the C&I rate, hammering it down, I mean, we've started this long process, and the governor has said on the campaign trail that we should accelerate it. But this is exactly where I'm going with this fiscal crisis situation, where we have a population of people who are beyond their working years that is large and growing. And because our economy underperforms, that population of people in their working years is getting smaller. People leave to go where the jobs are more plentiful and more promising. And so this is why, demographically, decade after decade, Pennsylvania continues to lose representation in the U.S. House because our population doesn't grow as robustly as the national average.
Yeah. Well, another evidence of that has to do with the high school graduates. There are fewer people graduating from Pennsylvania's high schools, which is a significant problem for Pennsylvania colleges in terms of recruiting students.
Right, exactly. And so the goal needs to be to improve Pennsylvania's economic competitiveness so that we can attract people to stay here or come here who are in their productive years, so that they choose to build lives and careers and families here in Pennsylvania, so that we have more folks pulling the wagon to pay for the people who, again, they've been promised these benefits, they deserve them, we've got to find a way to pay for them. And rather than just continuing to make economic conditions worse by increasing tax rates, we need to attack that competitiveness differential so that the economy can expand, so that we can keep those working age people.
All right, we're going to run to a break. I'll continue my conversation with David Taylor following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, I'm chatting with David Taylor. He's the president and CEO of Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. All right, David, workforce crisis. Is there one in the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, there surely is, and all of these issues are related. That even though Pennsylvania's unemployment rate is very low, it's masking a drop in our workforce participation rate, which means that people who are of working age, how many of them, or what proportion of them, are choosing to work or pursue work, and that number is
dropping,
is low and dropping, and that this is compounding our economic problems. That that employers can't find enough qualified new hires to fully staff up. As a result, it winds up being a hard cap on economic growth, because you can't, there's work to be had, contracts that you could bid on, but if you don't have the capacity in-house to do that work, there's no point in pursuing that.
This all begins with COVID. I mean, people, work remotely. Now, remote work is dominating the workforce now, it seems to me.
I don't know that that's so much of it, because even people who are working remotely in those jobs that can be, achieved in that way, they still would count as being participating in the workforce. What we're talking about here is people who are not working and not seeking work, and that trend is continuing to move downward. And so, again, the governor in his budget address talked about emphasizing career and technical education, bringing VOTEC back to all of the 500 physical public school districts, and again, also he made a gesture in that direction with relieving the requirement of a 4-year degree for most positions in state government. And so, we need to focus on providing the training to give younger people the skills to take up these, good-paying, family-sustaining jobs that exist in the economy in manufacturing and the skilled trades.
I'll tell you something. You can't go anywhere without seeing hiring signs on stores and shops, and you go through. And the fact of the matter is that businesses are closing. how many shops, how many restaurants have closed, not because they don't have enough business, but because they don't have any staff to
Right, they
perform
cut
the
back
job.
on hours, they're closed certain days. You see that more and more. And, you know, again, this is in part the demographic crisis, but also, I mean, we're in the midst of a cultural crisis, and so that's much more difficult to solve in terms of how do we encourage people to undertake work? How do we express the importance of the dignity of work and the self-respect that can only come from, you know, applying your talents to the world? It's a pretty serious problem. But what Harrisburg can do is that we need to improve our competitiveness with lowering the baseline costs of creating and keeping jobs in Pennsylvania, and that also that we can emphasize that kind of training through CTCs, VOTEC, and encouraging people to pursue those jobs.
You make a good point about the necessity of training and then reaching out to potential employers, you know, who are in search of people and having trouble finding individuals to perform the work, right?
And Terry, this is the opportunity that I see for real social progress, that due to this undeniable need, employers are going to have to cast the net wider, which means they're going to have to consider candidates they would not have considered before, people who've been outside the workforce, long-term unemployed, people coming off welfare, people coming out of jail. And if we can, again, for as many of those folks who can level up, for as many of those employers who can take that leap to connect people who've been, you know, outside of the workplace, to connect them with the dignity of work and the reward of a family-sustaining job, like that would be immense social progress for Pennsylvania, and I think that's really the opportunity of the moment.
Yeah, and how optimistic are you that that transition can go without having a recession?
Well, you know, flat out, Terry, I don't know. But we need to have, you know, vision and leadership, you know, not just in the business community, but in the social services world and all of the people and groups that interact with those, you know, populations that I mentioned.
And the partisanship must be left behind.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And when you look at the issue of corrections reform, that seems to have become a point of bipartisan consensus, and that, you know, my hope would be that this workforce issue and this you know, economic inclusion issue would be the next logical step from that.
Yeah. Well, all of this makes a great deal of sense, and hopefully our business as well, our business and labor leaders and our politicians will get together and work on resolving the problems that we face so the economy runs well and people are employed.
Yes, sir. Here's hoping.
Yeah, there you go. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, you stay well.